An innocent child's spirit and determination can often be underestimated. But when a cruel teacher crosses the line, it's the child's father, a man of power and respect, who ensures justice is served. Jamal sat quietly at his desk, the weight of expectation pressing down on him like an invisible force. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his notebook, eyes scanning the neatly printed words on the page in front of him. The classroom buzzed with whispered conversations and the occasional sound of pencils scratching against paper. But for Jamal, it felt like all eyes were on him, especially the sharp, unyielding gaze of Mrs. Taylor. She stood at the front of the classroom, her tailored blouse perfectly ironed, her expression one of rigid control. Everything about her exuded authority, from the way she carried herself to the way she spoke, her tone always edged with an air of superiority. Mrs. Taylor prided herself on maintaining a disciplined classroom, but her patience wore thin when it came to certain students like Jamal. "Jamal, stand up," she ordered, her voice cutting through the hum of the room. Jamal hesitated before slowly rising from his chair. He could feel his classmates' eyes shifting toward him, the room suddenly suffocating. His uniform, his crisp white shirt tucked into navy blue trousers, felt too tight, as though the fabric itself was squeezing the confidence out of him. "Read the sentence on the board," Mrs. Taylor instructed, tapping a long, manicured finger against the words written in bold chalk. Jamal swallowed hard. The letters blurred together, his mind scrambling to make sense of them, but the anxiety in his chest made it impossible to focus. He knew this feeling well. He had struggled with reading since the beginning of the year, but Mrs. Taylor had little patience for slow learners. I, he stammered, willing the words to form, but they wouldn't come. His throat tightened, his palms damp with sweat. The silence stretched painfully. A few students exchanged glances, some suppressing smirks. Mrs. Taylor sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "This is unacceptable," she declared, her voice laced with disappointment. "We have gone over this countless times, and yet you still cannot read a simple sentence. Perhaps you're not trying hard enough, Jamal." Her words stung, but it was what she did next that made the air in the classroom go still. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but it carried a cruel edge, the kind that humiliated rather than encouraged. She turned to the rest of the class. "Class, what do we think? Should a second grader still struggle with such basic reading?" A few hesitant chuckles rippled through the room. Jamal felt his face burn, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He wanted to disappear, to shrink into the floor and never return. His hands clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. But just when the embarrassment threatened to consume him, something snapped inside him. He may have been struggling, but he wasn't stupid. He wasn't worthless. And his father had always told him that if something wasn't right, he had every right to stand up for himself. "I am trying," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor arched a brow. "Excuse me?" Jamal took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had left. His small voice, though shaky, grew stronger. "I said I am trying." The classroom fell silent. No one had ever dared to challenge Mrs. Taylor before. Her expression darkened. "Don't talk back to me, young man." Jamal's hands balled into fists at his sides. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Never let anyone make you feel small. Speak your truth, always." And so he did. "You're not being fair," he said, his voice steady this time. "You always pick on me." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Taylor's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Go to the principal's office," she snapped. "Now!" Jamal didn't argue. He turned on his heel and walked out, his heart still hammering in his chest. But as he stepped into the hallway, something inside him shifted. He had stood up for himself, and somehow he knew this wasn't over. Jamal sat in his room, staring at his workbook, frustration bubbling in his chest. The words blurred together, his mind replaying Mrs. Taylor's laughter over and over again. No matter how hard he tried, he always seemed to fall short in her eyes. It wasn't that he didn't want to learn. He did. But reading out loud, forming the words on his tongue while everyone watched, felt impossible. He wasn't like the other kids who could breeze through a paragraph without hesitation. At home, things were different. His father, Mr. Davis, always told him that effort mattered more than perfection. "You don't have to be the best at everything, son," he often said, ruffling Jamal's hair, "but you do have to believe in yourself." His father was a man of importance, someone respected in the community. He was the president of the school board, and his voice carried weight. But even with his father's encouragement, Jamal couldn't shake the way Mrs. Taylor made him feel, like he wasn't enough. Jamal had tried his best in school, but nothing he did ever seemed to impress his teacher. Mrs. Taylor had made it clear from the beginning that she had little patience for students who held the class back. And Jamal, with his difficulty reading aloud and his nervous stammers, was always her target. He remembered the first time he had realized she didn't believe in him. It was months ago, during a spelling exercise. He had practiced the words at home, repeating them under his breath on the way to school. When it was his turn to spell necessary, he had hesitated for just a second too long. Mrs. Taylor had sighed loudly, shaking her head. "This is what happens when you don't put in the effort," she had said in front of the whole class. "Some people just aren't cut out for this level of work." The words had burned, settling deep inside him. He had put in the effort, but in her eyes it was never enough. Mrs. Taylor carried herself with an air of authority, her sharp features always set in a strict, unimpressed expression. She prided herself on being firm, believing that her high standards pushed students to be better. But the truth was, she only pushed certain students. Jamal noticed how she praised others for their attempts, encouraging them even when they stumbled. But with him, she never had patience. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Other kids whispered about how she always seemed harder on him, how she rarely smiled when he spoke, but beamed at other students. But no one said anything out loud. She was the teacher, and her authority was unquestioned. That night, as Jamal sat at his desk, staring at his workbook, he wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. Maybe no matter how much he practiced, he would always be the kid who stumbled over his words, the one who made Mrs. Taylor sighs in disappointment. But then he thought of his father, of the way he always told him to hold his head high. "You don't let anyone tell you who you are." His father's voice echoed in his mind. "You decide that for yourself." Jamal clenched his fists. Mrs. Taylor didn't get to decide his worth, and tomorrow he wasn't going to let her make him feel small anymore. What would you do if you saw someone being treated unfairly in a public setting? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Jamal sat on his bed, staring at the open notebook in front of him. The words on the page blurred together as frustration built inside him. No matter how hard he tried, school felt like an uphill battle. His hands gripped the pencil tightly, the paper beneath it filled with scratched-out attempts at forming sentences. He wanted to be better. He wanted to prove that he could do it. But Mrs. Taylor's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. "Perhaps you're not trying hard enough, Jamal." He swallowed the lump in his throat, blinking away the sting of her words. It wasn't that he didn't try. He did. Every night, he spent hours practicing his reading and writing, but every time he walked into that classroom, his confidence crumbled under Mrs. Taylor's gaze. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she looked at him, like he was already a failure before he even opened his mouth. A deep voice from the doorway pulled him from his thoughts. "You okay, son?" Jamal looked up to see his father, Mr. Davis, standing there with his usual strong posture and steady eyes. Mr. Davis was an important man, president of the school board, respected by everyone who knew him. But to Jamal, he was simply Dad, the man who always told him he could be anything he wanted to be. Jamal hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine." His father stepped inside, his eyes scanning the messy notebook pages. He picked one up, flipping through it, his expression thoughtful. "You've been working hard," he noted, placing the notebook back on the bed. "But something's bothering you." Jamal sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "It's just school." Mr. Davis sat beside him, waiting patiently. Jamal knew his father wasn't the type to pry, but he also wouldn't leave until he got to the bottom of things. After a long silence, Jamal finally spoke. "It's Mrs. Taylor," he admitted. She always makes me feel like I'm not good enough. Like no matter what I do, I'll never be smart enough." His father's expression darkened slightly. "What do you mean?" Jamal shifted uncomfortably. "She calls on me when she knows I don't have the answer. She makes jokes about me in front of the class. Today, she made everyone laugh at me." Mr. Davis clenched his jaw, his usual calm demeanor momentarily shaken. "She made fun of you?" Jamal nodded. "She laughed at me when I messed up reading. She told the whole class that I wasn't trying hard enough." He hesitated before adding, "She doesn't do that to anyone else. Just me." Mr. Davis exhaled slowly, his gaze sharpening. "Jamal, listen to me." He turned his son to face him. "You are not dumb. You are not less than anyone else in that class. Do you hear me?" Jamal nodded, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. His father continued, his voice steady but firm. "Sometimes, people like Mrs. Taylor look at kids like you and decide your future before you even have a chance to show them who you are. But that doesn't mean they're right. It just means they're wrong, and it's up to you to prove it." Jamal swallowed hard. "But what if I can't?" "You can," Mr. Davis said without hesitation. "And I'll make sure you get the chance to." Jamal looked at his father, sensing the seriousness in his voice. He didn't know what his father was planning, but something told him that this wasn't over. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flicker of hope. "Get your things, son," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to have a talk with your school." The next morning, the halls of the school felt heavier than usual. Teachers and students alike stole glances at Mr. Davis as he walked down the hallway, his presence commanding. He wasn't just any parent. He was the president of the school board, and he wasn't here for pleasantries. The principal, Mrs. Cartwright, greeted him nervously in the front office. "Mr. Davis, what brings you here today?" she asked, already sensing that this wasn't a social visit. "My son," he said plainly, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder, "and an incident that happened in his classroom yesterday." The room fell silent. Mrs. Taylor, who had been called in just moments before, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The color drained from her face when she realized what was happening. "I understand that teachers have standards," Mr. Davis continued, his voice unwavering. "But humiliating a child in front of his classmates, belittling him instead of teaching him. That's not education. That's abuse. Mrs. Taylor opened her mouth, her usual air of authority faltering. I didn't mean it like that, she stammered. I hold all of my students to the same standards. Do you? Mr. Davis challenged, his eyes locking onto hers. Because from what my son has told me, and from what I've observed, that doesn't seem to be the case. The principal glanced between them, suddenly aware of the magnitude of the situation. There will be a formal review, Mrs. Cartwright said quickly. We take complaints of this nature very seriously, Mr. Davis. Mrs. Taylor stiffened. You can't seriously think I meant any harm. I was just trying to push him to do better. Encouragement and belittlement are two different things, Mr. Davis responded coolly. A teacher's job is to uplift, not destroy a child's confidence. And if you don't know the difference, then perhaps you shouldn't be in a classroom at all. The words struck Mrs. Taylor hard. She had spent years in that school, never once being challenged for the way she handled students like Jamal. But now, under the weight of Mr. Davis's unshaken composure, she felt her authority crumbling. Jamal watched in silence, his heart pounding. He had never seen anyone stand up to Mrs. Taylor before, but his father wasn't afraid. He didn't yell, didn't argue, he simply laid out the truth. And for the first time, Jamal saw something in Mrs. Taylor's face that he never thought he would. Fear. As they left the office, Mr. Davis placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. No one has the right to make you feel less than you are, he said firmly. Not even a teacher. Jamal nodded, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that felt a lot like pride. The news spread through the school like wildfire. Mrs. Taylor, the once untouchable and authoritative teacher, was placed on administrative leave pending an official investigation. Students whispered in the hallways, and parents began asking questions. Some were shocked, unable to believe that a respected teacher had been called out for mistreatment. Others, particularly students who had also felt the weight of her bias, silently felt a sense of justice finally being served. Jamal walked through the hallways, feeling a strange mixture of relief and nervousness. He had never expected things to unfold this way. The idea that a teacher, an adult, could actually face consequences for their actions had seemed impossible before. But now, because of his father's unwavering stance, the entire school was forced to acknowledge the truth. At home, Mr. Davis made sure his son understood the significance of what had happened. "This isn't just about you, Jamal," he said, as they sat in the living room that evening. "It's about making sure no other child has to feel the way you did. It's about holding people accountable for their actions." Jamal nodded, the words sinking in. He had spent so long feeling powerless in that classroom, but now he knew that he had a voice, and that voice mattered. Meanwhile, the school board convened to discuss Mrs. Taylor's actions. With complaints surfacing from other students and parents, her once pristine record was tarnished. The administration, under pressure from the board and the community, had no choice but to take action. By the end of the week, Mrs. Taylor was officially dismissed from her position. For the first time in years, the students who had suffered under her biases felt a collective weight lift. Her departure sent a strong message, one that reached beyond just one classroom. Teachers became more mindful of how they treated their students, and conversations about fairness and bias began happening among staff. The environment at the school, which had once been rigid and unyielding, began to shift. For Jamal, life took on a new perspective. He wasn't just the quiet boy who struggled with school anymore. He was the boy who had stood up, who had been defended and had been heard. His confidence, once shaky, began to grow. He participated more in class, raised his hand without fear, and, for the first time, felt like he belonged. One afternoon, as he walked out of school, another student, a younger boy, ran up to him. "Hey, Jamal," he said hesitantly. I saw what happened with Mrs. Taylor. That was really brave." Jamal smiled, nodding. "Thanks," he said. And in that moment, he realized that his experience had done more than just change his own life. It had created a ripple effect that was changing the school for the better. His father, watching his son's transformation, knew that standing up for Jamal had been the right decision. Mr. Davis had always believed in justice, but seeing his son walk taller, speak more confidently, and finally feel like he had a place in the world made every effort worth it. He knew there was still work to be done, but this victory was an important one. The school administration sent out an official letter to parents, acknowledging what had happened and reinforcing their commitment to fairness and equal treatment for all students. It was the first step in a long overdue change, but it was a step nonetheless. Other teachers took note, realizing that their words and actions carried weight, and that no student should ever feel as though they were destined to fail because of who they were. Jamal's story spread beyond just his school. His father's powerful response to injustice resonated with parents in the community, prompting deeper discussions about how children were treated in academic spaces. Families came together, sharing their own experiences and advocating for a more inclusive and supportive learning environment. One day, as Jamal sat in his classroom, his new teacher called on him to read aloud. His heart still raced a little, but he took a deep breath and read with confidence. No interruptions, no belittling, no fear. When he finished, the teacher nodded approvingly. "Well done, Jamal," she said, her voice warm and encouraging. Jamal smiled, a real, genuine smile. He had found his place. He had fought for it, and with the support of his father, he had won. His journey wasn't just about overcoming his own struggles. It was about changing the system, one step at a time. And as he walked home that day, the sun shining a little brighter, he knew that this was only the beginning. Jamal's story wasn't just about one teacher's mistreatment. It was about a system that had long allowed such behavior to go unchecked. For years, students like him had suffered in silence, accepting belittlement as a normal part of their education. But when Jamal found the courage to speak up, and when his father used his position to hold the school accountable, everything changed. The fallout from Mrs. Taylor's actions sent ripples far beyond just one classroom. Other teachers, who had once ignored the subtle biases in their own words and actions, began to reflect on their behavior. Conversations about fair treatment, racial bias, and student dignity became more frequent in the teacher's lounge. Faculty meetings addressed the need for cultural sensitivity, and professional training on unconscious bias was introduced into the school's policies. For the first time, students who had once felt powerless saw that change was possible. If Jamal, an 8-year-old boy, could stand up for himself and demand fairness, then perhaps they could too. He had not only paved the way for a better education for himself, but for every child who came after him. Jamal, for his part, began to thrive. Without the daily weight of Mrs. Taylor's constant criticism, he found himself more engaged in class. His new teacher encouraged him, recognizing his potential rather than his struggles. She helped him develop confidence, praising his efforts rather than tearing him down for his mistakes. Slowly, Jamal's fear of participating in class faded. He no longer hesitated to raise his hand, no longer second-guessed himself before speaking. One afternoon, as he packed his books into his backpack, a younger student approached him nervously. "Hey, Jamal," the boy said. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened with Mrs. Taylor. You were really brave. My older brother used to have her, and he always felt the same way you did. I think it's really cool that you stood up to her." Jamal smiled, surprised by the comment. He hadn't thought about how his actions might affect others. "Thanks," he said. "It was my dad, really." He made sure people listened. The younger boy nodded. "Still, I think you're really brave." That moment stayed with Jamal. He realized that courage wasn't just about fighting back. It was about knowing your worth, even when others tried to make you feel small. He had spent so much time believing Mrs. Taylor's words, letting them make him doubt himself. But now he knew better. At home, Mr. Davis couldn't have been prouder of his son. He had always told Jamal to believe in himself, but he knew how difficult that could be in a world that often judged people unfairly. When he had confronted Mrs. Taylor, it hadn't just been about his son. It had been about ensuring that no child ever had to feel the way Jamal had felt in that classroom. Mr. Davis's actions had also sent a message to the school board. The investigation into Mrs. Taylor's conduct led to further scrutiny of other teachers, ensuring that every educator upheld the values of fairness and respect. While one teacher had been removed, a much-needed change had begun. For Jamal, life was different now. He had once dreaded school, but now he walked through the hallways with his head held high. He knew he had the right to be there, the right to learn, and the right to be treated with respect. One day, while working on an assignment, his new teacher approached his desk. "Jamal, this is great work," she said, smiling. "You've come so far." Jamal looked at the words on his paper, feeling proud of what he had written. "Thanks," he said, and for the first time, he truly believed it. His story was more than just a lesson in justice. It was proof that standing up for yourself could change everything. It was a reminder that no matter how small you felt, your voice mattered. Jamal's experience wasn't just about surviving a cruel teacher. It was about standing up for his dignity and proving that no one is defined by the prejudices others hold. This story serves as a reminder that actions have consequences. Mrs. Taylor's unchecked racism wasn't just an attack on Jamal. It was a reflection of the biases that exist in our society. But with support, respect, and determination, Jamal was able to turn the tide and teach us all that we should never underestimate the strength of a young person fighting for what's right.